Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? As was noted, we do have a manel here, and I'll just reinforce that at E3G, we're always striving to have that balance, diversity, gender diversity, racial diversity. We didn't achieve it with my panel. Well, we achieved the racial diversity. Kind of dropped it onto the gender diversity. But we always strive to make sure that we have balance. Thank you for joining us today. The topic, what do we do with a problem like the US? I'll have to be honest with you. Originally, when I saw this title, I kind of winced because I don't think of my home country as a problem. But when we talk about international climate issues, the United States is a problem. We drop in and out of climate treaties. We tend to do things in a very bilateral or unilateral way. But this year, it's the largest year in terms of elections across the board, across the world. Estimated 49% of the global population is going to the polls this year. And we have elections we've had in Indonesia, South Africa, EU elections a couple of weeks ago. And I believe there might be a small election coming up in the UK on the 4th of July. And the other election that is getting a lot of attention is the election in the United States on November 5th. It draws outside its attention. The idea that the US election holds unprecedented significance is something that happens with every US election. Just in the 30 years that I've been in Washington, D.C., it seems like every 4 years, it's like the most important election in American history. This year is not an exaggeration, I would say, that this is an important election, not only in American history and for the United States, but for the world. And what we've done is bring together 3 people to help us talk about where we are in the U.S. on climate, on just our role in the world in general. Forgive me for saying our all the time. It's a tick. But our elections are very important to the rest of the world, and where we're going is really relevant to the people in this room and the people around the world. So over the next 25 minutes, this panel is going to explore the state of politics in the U.S., analyze the potential outcomes of the election, and assess their implications for climate and for the U.S. role in the world. To help me do that, I'm very grateful to Professor Michael Cox, Professor Emeritus and Founding Director of LSC Ideas, and Associate Fellow for the U.S. and Americas Program at Chatham House. I'm grateful for you stepping in at the last moment. Alden Meyer, my colleague in Washington, D.C., Senior Associate at E3G. Alden has been to, I believe, every COP. He missed one COP. So he is indeed not perfect, but that is a very close to perfect record. Alden has 30 years of experience in Washington, D.C., at least 30, including at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he served as the Director of Strategy and the Director of the Washington office. And then we also have Dr. Fergus Green, lecturer in political theory and public policy at UCL. So in a time when the world is grappling with economic uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, and technological revolution, and the increasingly urgent need for climate action, the direction taken by the U.S. is of paramount importance. So let's not hear from me so much, but let's hear from our guests here. Professor Cox wrote a really interesting book that one of the benefits of jet lag is being able to extend the amount of time you're reading it. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm reading Agonies of Empire, American Power from Clinton to Biden. And it was a great look at the challenges that U.S. presidents have faced in the post-Cold War era. And I would like it if you sort of set the stage for us, the geopolitical moment we're in, how the U.S. elections tie in to that geopolitical moment, and from your perspective, many decades of doing research and insight in the U.S., visiting the U.S., teaching at William and Mary, please set up for us where you think that this moment in the United States, where we have this rage of populism going on, and discontent. 76% of the American public feels like the country's going in the wrong direction. Give us your overview, a brief overview of how did we get here?
Yeah, thanks for those 12 questions, which I will try and undertake to answer in at least 2 to 3 minutes.
I was going for lucky 13, but almost.
Okay, well, that's great. And do buy the book, of course. It goes without saying. All academics self-promote, as you know. Look, how we got here, the simple answer is there is no simple answer. You can put it down to several factors. One is the downside consequences of globalization and people left behind all around the world. We've got here because of the peculiarities of the American electoral system, where you can still win the majority of votes, but nonetheless not win the White House. We've got here because we live in a world which is increasingly full of massive geopolitical tensions. You know which ones I'm talking about. There's a war in Europe, there's a terrible tragedy unfolding in the Eastern Mediterranean and Gaza. You know, we have all of those things. What I think we're living in more generally, Clarence, I can put it like this, we're living in an era which has gone away, but we don't know what's coming towards us. That's the way I'd look at it. I mean, it kind of says we did have an order, which we call the post-Cold War order. We are now in a transition to something we don't know what it is. Let's be perfectly honest about it. You can call it multipolar, you can call it something new, you can call it chaos, you can even call it, as many have called it, a post-American world. Ooh. You can even call it the end of the liberal order, the disintegration of the liberal order. But we are in that, and you know, Xi Jinping says it right. You know, we're living in an age of huge and great changes, and I'm not sure he knows where it's going to, and I'm pretty damn certain that lots of people in this room, including me, I should add, don't know where we're going to. All we know is the uncertainty where we are now at. Where populism comes from is all the reasons I've already given. One thing is clear. We don't know who's going to win this upcoming election, let's be honest. And that's the greatest uncertainty in the world, because when the country which has got the biggest economy in the world and is the second largest emitter of pollution in the world, we don't know where it's going to go in November. By December, do we know who's going to be sitting in that White House and what policies is that particular president going to follow? Because we do know one thing. America's polarized, and it's polarized as much between the two presidential candidates on climate change as it is on anything else. And that is the great worry going ahead, Clarence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I was just thinking about the fact that the former National Security Advisor for President Trump, Robert O'Brien, was on Face the Nation, American television news program, talking about the need to ramp up U.S. energy security by increasing oil production. It just popped into my head when you were talking. There's a tremendous difference. It's a very stark difference between the direction we could go in under Trump and the direction we could go in under Biden. Alden, I wanted to ask you, when Professor Cox has written that the U.S. can often decide to act with minimal consultation, which kind of made me chuckle when I read it, because that happens under Democrats and it happens under Republicans. How does this work out in the international climate space? And if you could maybe talk a little bit about these two potential scenarios that we see ahead of us, where we could go into, the U.S. could go in the direction of getting behind fossil fuels in a very serious way again, and really basically, well, the question is, how much does that slow down the energy transition? And the flip side, a Biden administration, where do you think we could go under a Biden administration, and how do these scenarios fit in the world that the professor has described?
Well, thanks, Clarence, and I have been to all but one of the COPs. A lot of people call me a fossil, along with Jennifer Morgan and Bill Hare and a few others. Others call me a serial masochist, repeating the same thing and expecting a different result, but we'll leave that aside. I mean, we do face a really stark choice on this. I have watched the U.S. over the years. We are the country that treats the rest of the world like a yo-yo. We insisted that the Rio Treaty be entirely voluntary because the American way of life was not negotiable before the first President Bush agreed to sign it and submit it for ratification. We insisted that the Kyoto Protocol include emissions trading, all 6 greenhouse gases, not the policies and measures approach the EU wanted, when Bill Clinton and Al Gore had no strategy to ratify it in the Senate. And then, of course, President Trump, after 6 months of careful deliberation, pulled us out of Paris, not even understanding what the agreement was. So the world has reason to be angry with us. If Biden gets reelected, we will see the U.S. submit an NDC for 2035. It will probably be in the 65 plus range reductions by 2035. They will still have a lot of work to do to meet the 2030 target of 50 to 52%, much less 65. They will have to go pedal to the metal on using executive authority and regulations in the face of an increasingly conservative court and Supreme Court, which will be a challenge. They will have to rely on subnational governments, mayors, governors, businesses, investors, others stepping up even more than they have. The morning I woke up after President Trump's election in Marrakesh, We Are Still In was launched, which was a subnational coalition to say America does not equal Trump and to present that face of climate ambition to the world. That will be very important either scenario. Because most policy in the U.S. is driven at the state and local level, not in Washington, despite what people may think. On the international front, the administration will live into trying to encourage others to step up NDC ambition. They're already working on that, trying to get a group of countries to hold hands and announce their NDCs together at the G20 summit in November during the second week of the COP. They will engage on the new post-2025 climate finance goal. The one thing Clarence and I both know in our bones is that the president has no power when it comes to money in our system. The saying is the president proposes, Congress disposes. Our Constitution gives the Congress total control over finance in the U.S. So to change the U.S. doing much less than our fair share of finance for international decarbonization and resilience, we have to change the thinking of the Republican Party, and that is a task of months, of years, not months. We also will see some action on trade. They have launched a trade and climate task force looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms, looking at working with Europe, the UK, and others around reforms of the WTO. Who knows where that's going to go, but they are going to actively engage in that if they get a second term. And finally, G20 and G7 leadership. The U.S. holds the presidency of the G20 in 2026 and of the G7 in 2027. They have clearly indicated that their G20 presidency will in part focus on recapitalizing and increasing the finances for the MDBs and the international system, building on what Brazil is doing and hopefully what South Africa will do. If you look at Donald Trump take two, it's a very different message. I mean, he will be a domestic and international climate wrecking ball. There's no doubt about that. He will pull out of Paris on day one, not day 180. The question will be, will he also pull out of the Framework Convention on climate change? Or, even worse, will he decide to stay in and try to build a coalition of the unwilling with the Saudis and other malefactors and destroy it from the inside? Those are the two options, as I see it. He will try to gut climate finance, and the question is, will we be able to work with some Republicans to prevent that in a Congress? And of course, the Senate is quite likely to go Republican, even if Biden wins re-election, because of who's up for election this year. You could have a Republican Senate and the House flipping Democratic. So the congressional outcome matters. We don't really know what it's going to be. Domestically, you're right, Clarence. He says drill, baby, drill.
Drill, baby,
he talks about energy dominance, ignoring the fact that under President Biden, oil and gas production and exports have increased to all-time highs. So it's fact-free, but it's his rhetoric. He wants to roll back the Inflation Reduction Act, although I think rolling back the tax incentives, which may amount to over $1 trillion, will be very difficult, primarily because over half of those incentives are going to Republican states, and they love the money even though they voted against the bill. America's all in. That will be key in this strategy, just like it all is. It was in the last time. One thing you may not know is there's a almost 1,000-page report put out at the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025. One of its principal goals, not just on climate, but across the board, is to decapitate the administrative state. What they mean by that is President Trump would issue an executive order on day one, fire 16,000 senior civil servants that drive the real action in departments across the federal government, and by the time the courts catch up, it'll be too late. The rest of the bureaucracy will be terrorized. They will fall into line instantly. He will also not put in place people that challenge him this time around. He wants yes men and yes women. He does not want anyone fighting back from inside and leaking to the press what he's up to. So it'll be a totally different regime than we saw in the first go-round. The only thing is a wild card. Trump has no policy credits or leanings. He makes it up as he goes along, and chaos could rule despite the best efforts of those in the Heritage Foundation and others that want to wire the system for total change from what the Democrats have been doing.
Well, now that we all want to break...
Is it time for drinks yet?
Have a drink. But I appreciate that context, Alden, because it is... I think that this is something important to get across to people overseas, that this isn't just... I mean, we all know about Trump's policies and so forth, but this is... I said to my boss, I said, honestly, if Trump wins, we're going to have bigger problems in the U.S. than even climate change. Because, as Alden mentioned, decapitating the administrative state, following through on, pushing back on something called the Chevron doctrine, really going at the heart of what makes the federal government function. That's really the goal. And it's not even necessarily Trump's goal, but it's the people with him who have a particular view of the world and see that view being really held back by the government. And so it is as code red. My heart started palpitating listening to Alden.
I didn't even mention NATO, Ukraine, China, trade, SDGs.
Stop right there. That's it. Thank you, Alden. That will do. Everyone take a breath. It's going to be okay. Dr. Green, your work, I was reading, the other piece I was reading at 3 o'clock in the morning, your science piece entitled No New Fossil Fuel Projects, The Norm We Need. And I really vibe with the whole thing that you're writing and talking about in that science piece. But I try to, in my mind, my question is to you, how do we get to that world? How do we get to that state when we have a problem child like the United States, where, I will have to be honest with you, fossil fuels, Dick Cheney once said that we were given fossil fuels in the United States because God blessed us with fossil fuels. And it seemed a little bit hyperbolic, but I try to explain to people that the fossil fuel industry, which started up in Pennsylvania in the 19th century at the beginning of another industrial revolution, is embedded psychologically in America's concept of freedom. Our role as a superpower. It's what built the country. It's what raised a lot of people from poverty into the middle class, including a lot of people of color. It is like trying to extract the nervous system out of a country. Not to make it sound too difficult, but that's what it's going to be like. So with that set up, how do you see us getting to that world where we are really cracking down on fossil fuels? And give us your thoughts on that, and maybe a little bit, or a lot if you'd like, on how do you square that circle?
Great, thanks. So let me set the context. So we start from recognizing the reality that we're in there's a weird disconnect between rhetoric and action on climate and fossil fuels. So if you go to the COP last year, countries recommitted themselves to the 1.5 degree goal. We have record numbers of net zero commitments from governments and business. And we know that those goals imply a rapid phase out of fossil fuel production and power generation. And we went even further at the last COP with a commitment to take steps essentially to phase down fossil fuels, to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. For the first time, we have explicit language on that. And yet, at the same time, in 2023, we've seen expansions in fossil fuel consumption, production, and investment. The International Energy Agency says there was more than $1 trillion of investment last year in fossil fuel production and power generation infrastructure. And so that's the weird disconnect that we start from. And so it seems to me, given the challenges that you've mentioned and that others have talked about today in terms of phasing out fossil fuels, that's essential but really, really difficult. It's easier to not build new fossil fuel projects, not allow new exploration, extraction, and power generation fossil fuel projects in the first place, right? Because of how difficult it is to phase out the existing ones. And so in the paper that you mentioned, my co-authors who are energy systems modelers and we basically looked at the findings from the International Energy Agency and sort of extended those, which basically sort of show that if we're serious about 1.5, and if you look at a range of the scenarios for staying within 1.5 degrees, the economic scenarios, and we look at the oil production, gas-fired power generation, and coal-fired power generation, those 4 categories, if you look at the energy needs across a range of those scenarios, and then we compare that with existing and planned capacity across each of those 4 categories. And what we find is that in order to kind of stay within the 1.5 degree constraints, we don't need to be building new fossil fuel projects, right? There's a couple of the categories you might need under some scenarios, some of the fields that are in development, gas fields, and some of the gas-fired power stations that are under construction. Beyond that, it's not needed. So we've kind of affirmed, extended that International Energy Agency point that we really don't need new fossil fuel projects in the transition to net zero. And so then we make the point that, in theory, you could still get to net zero by building a lot more fossil fuels now and then phasing out even more quickly, but that would be totally irrational because of it's economically costlier and politically much more difficult for some of the reasons you've alluded to. And so getting to the kind of what might this mean, and in the context of a difficult country like the US, though it's far from the only one, it's far from the only rich country that's expanding fossil fuels. I'm from Australia, and the Australian government is still green-lighting new large coal and gas projects, and there are a number of other countries in the OECD. So this is a problem, and we think that trying to start with countries that are willing to stop new fossil fuel projects and building club arrangements like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, like the Powering Past Coal Alliance that Chris talked about earlier. And we need more of those for the other pieces of the fossil fuel puzzle so we can build from the ambition that's already there and then try and create a norm against new fossil fuel projects that can put pressure from outside on countries that are not complying with that norm. It can also facilitate some of the domestic resistance. Alden, you were talking about at the state level, it can help civil society that's pushing for a lot of these actions. So, I think a norm-building approach requires sort of making no new fossil fuel projects an aspect of climate leadership, and a litmus test for climate leadership could help somewhat in this kind of more challenging geopolitical context where we do have some countries that are determined to push ahead with more fossil fuels.
Let me ask you really quick, because Alden and I serve on the board of the Price and Carbon Initiative in the U.S. Is what you've laid out there, would that be facilitated if we were able to do legislation on carbon pricing or polluter pays, or just to start ramping down?
Sure, it would certainly help. A carbon price would obviously help, shift investment flows. But it's funny that today's, I think, that's the first time we mentioned carbon pricing today, right? It's probably indicative of how much carbon pricing has sort of fallen off the agenda, I think, as it's been recognized how politically difficult it is. Certainly in the US, it's not even on the which we're talking about. It's definitely not on the table. Obviously, the IRA was kind of an alternative approach. So, where it's possible to do carbon pricing, that's generally a good thing and will generally help. But we need some really clear red lines, I think. And I think making a red line that if you're serious about being a climate leader and taking action on climate change, and you're serious about 1.5 and net zero, then a pretty reasonable litmus test, I think, should be that you're not allowing new fossil fuel production and fossil fuel power generation.
As a former climate lobbyist, I had to put a plug in for carbon pricing. Oh, please,
Yeah,
go
I was
ahead.
going to get back onto the question of climate leadership, because the whole question for the United States isn't just leadership on climate, it is what are the consequences of the US not leading in a particular way on climate?
Right.
And it means two things. One, it means that its relationship with its main allies in Europe and across Asia are severely compromised, because the very nature of American leadership requires it, simply requires it as a global player with influence to have a position on climate change and signing up to the major agreements, because that buys all the rest of its allies into that relationship. And it would be a severe compromise for the US as a global leader if indeed what we fear most in November happens. Let's be perfectly blunt about it. The second point I'd make, and it's often forgotten, I think, the United States, it's not often forgotten, it's actually talked about all the time now. The United States is in a long-term competition, whatever you want to call it, with China. And in some ways, that competition now revolves in part around a whole bunch of things like technology, military power, all the sorts of things we've been talking about for years, but it revolves around who leads on climate change.
Right.
And at the moment, unless I'm reading the runes wrong, and maybe I'm reading the wrong newspapers, it looks to me that China's doing a pretty good job in some areas on climate because of EV, because of solar panels and all the rest, and is seen as a kind of somebody who can lead on this better than the US. And if that happens, then the US again loses enormous international status and stature.
You raise a really interesting point, because climate leadership is also tied to scientific leadership. And I wanted to ask Alden about, I wanted to ask all three of you about this. The pressure on a Republican administration and on a Trump administration to keep up that lead or that competition with China, at what point does it force Republicans, in your minds, to really listen to the 70-plus members of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and also always remind people it's not a uniform view on climate action amongst conservatives? At E3G in Washington, we do a lot of outreach to conservative Republicans to talk about climate issues. They're very much in favor of things like carbon pricing, except for when it comes to actually producing a bill on the floor and passing it. But Alden, in the minute we have left, use 30 seconds of it. You could even be a yes or no. Do you think that the pressure on a Republican administration to compete with China and to keep up that technological edge will force them off of where they are now on climate?
No, because Trump uber alles. I mean, he is dominating the Republican Party. What he says goes. There won't be a platform again at the convention. They'll leave it to him to make it up. There is a generational war going on within the Republican Party now. Young conservatives want their party to be more proactive on climate, but they are losing out to the fossil fuel industry dominated elders that continue to take the campaign contributions and determine policies. So this is going to be a war. And on carbon pricing, I would say, first thing you do is you take off the negative price on carbon we have now. I pointed out in Dubai, we may have mobilized 800 million the first day of the COP for loss and damage. We continue to spend 3.5 billion a day subsidizing production and consumption of something we say is an existential threat. That's the definition of insanity.
Thank you for that. We've only been able to scratch the surface of, you could do an entire conference. I'm not advocating for this, but maybe I am. You could do an entire conference on the US political dynamic and what it means for the rest of the world. But I did want to leave us on a more positive note and say this. 5 months, we are 5 months away from the November 5th elections. And in the US political world, 5 months is an eternity. Anything can happen, truly anything can happen. And we live in a world where anything seems to happen all the time. So keep watching it. Don't give up hope. There's an interesting debate coming up on the 27th. And we've got party conventions in the summertime, and then we're going to roll into a fall where the American public will actually start paying attention because no one in the American public is paying attention to this, except for me and Alden.
4 months and 10 days, but who's counting?
Who's counting? But so we're going to keep watching this issue and learning more about it, and keeping our colleagues here in Europe informed. If you want more information about it, you know where to find E3G and E3G in Washington. So thank you very much for your time.